Growing up in rural Texas in the late 1960s, I was no stranger to the great outdoors. Our home was nestled in a sprawling expanse of wilderness, about a 2 to 3 hour drive north of Houston. It was a place where nature reigned supreme, where the line between civilization and the wild was often blurred. My father was an avid hunter, a passion he passed down to me from an early age. By the time I was 12, I was already familiar with the weight of a rifle in my hands and the quiet thrill of tracking game through the dense undergrowth. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for us, it was a way of life, a connection to the land and our ancestors who had carved out a living from this unforgiving terrain. The incident I'm about to recount happened during one of those crisp autumn mornings when the air is sharp with the promise of the coming winter. I had woken up before dawn, excitement coursing through my veins at the prospect of a day's hunting. My brother, just a year younger than me, was supposed to join, but when I went to wake him, he was dead to the world, snoring softly in his bed. "Come on, wake up," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. But he didn't budge, lost in the depths of sleep that only a preteen boy can achieve. After a few more futile attempts, I made a decision that would change my life forever. Screw it, I thought. I'll go alone. Looking back now, I can see the foolishness of that choice. But at 12 years old, I felt invincible, confident in my abilities, and eager to prove myself. So, with a mixture of excitement and defiance, I gathered my gear, a flashlight, my trusty rifle, and a bag of trail mix, and set out into the pre-dawn darkness. The woods were different in the dark, alive with sounds and shadows that the daylight kept at bay. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the gloom, barely penetrating the thick canopy overhead. I moved carefully, my footsteps muffled by years of fallen leaves, my senses alert for any sign of movement. As I walked, the sky began to lighten, the black of night giving way to the gray of early morning. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the woods in soft golden light, I no longer needed my flashlight. I switched it off, relishing the quiet of the forest around me. I had been walking for about half an hour when it happened. The change was sudden, like stepping from a warm room into a freezer. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the mild temperature. It wasn't a physical cold, but something deeper, more primal. It was the feeling of being watched. I gripped my rifle tighter, its familiar weight offering little comfort against this unseen threat. My eyes scanned the surrounding woods, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what might be causing this sudden unease. But the forest remained still, indifferent to my growing fear. Trying to shake off the feeling, I kept walking, but each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very air was thickening around me. Then I heard it, a sharp crack that cut through the morning silence like a gunshot, a twig snapping underfoot. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. Time seemed to stretch as I stood there, barely breathing, straining my ears for any further sound. And then it began. Laughter. At first it was distant, barely audible over the rustle of leaves and the gentle morning breeze. But there was something about it that chilled me to my very core. It wasn't the carefree laughter of a fellow hiker or the mischievous giggle of my brother playing a prank. This laughter held a note of malice, of otherworldly glee that had no place in these familiar woods. My first thought, born of desperate hope rather than reason, was that it must be my brother. Perhaps he had woken up after all and followed me, intending to scare me as payback for leaving him behind. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "Stop messing around before I shoot." But there was no response. No sheepish grin from behind a tree, no admission of a joke taken too far. Only that terrible laughter, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Fear gripped me then, a fear unlike anything I had ever known. These woods, which had always been a second home to me, suddenly felt alien and hostile. Every shadow held a potential threat, every rustling leaf a harbinger of doom. I turned and began walking back the way I had come, trying to move quickly without breaking into a run. But with each step the laughter grew louder, closer. It was as if whatever was producing that sound was toying with me, letting me think I could escape only to dash that hope with its ever-nearing presence. My walk became a jog, the jog a run. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the noise I was making. All thoughts of hunting were forgotten. I was prey now, fleeing from a predator I couldn't see but whose presence I felt with every fiber of my being. As I ran, the laughter seemed to multiply, coming at me from all directions. It was no longer just behind me, but to my sides, ahead of me, even seeming to come from above. The sound filled the woods, drowning out the pounding of my heart and the ragged gasps of my breathing. In desperation, I stopped and spun around, my rifle raised. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and exertion. "Show yourself!" For a moment the woods fell silent. The sudden absence of the laughter was almost as terrifying as the sound itself had been. Then, just as I began to hope that perhaps it had all been in my imagination, a voice spoke. "I'm going to get you." The words were simple, almost childish in their threat. But the voice that uttered them was anything but. Deep and guttural, it seemed to come from the earth itself, reverberating through the ground beneath my feet and the very air around me. Terror, pure and primal, seized me. I ran. I ran as I had never run before, heedless of direction or destination. My only thought was to get away, to escape that voice and the nameless horror it promised. As I fled, the laughter started again. No longer content to merely follow, it now surrounded me, pressing in from all sides. It was in the rustle of leaves overhead, the crunch of twigs underfoot, the very air I gasped into my burning lungs. The pressure built, a physical force that threatened to crush me. The world seemed to darken, as if the laughter was somehow blotting out the sun itself. I felt myself beginning to lose control, my mind unable to cope with the terror that engulfed me. In that moment of utter despair, some deeply buried instinct took over. My hands, operating independently of my panic-stricken mind, raised my rifle. Without conscious thought, I pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, impossibly loud in the confined space of the forest. And just like that, the laughter stopped. The pressure lifted, the darkness receded. I was alone in the woods once more, the echo of the gunshot fading into the distance. For a long moment I stood there, my rifle still raised, ears ringing from the shot. Then, as the reality of what had happened began to sink in, I moved with frantic haste. I gathered my scattered belongings, the flashlight I had dropped in my panic, the bag of trail mix that had spilled across the forest floor, and I ran. I ran without stopping, without looking back, until I burst from the tree line and saw my house in the distance. Only when my feet hit the worn wood of our front porch did I finally allow myself to slow down, to breathe. My father, alerted by the sound of my approach, met me at the door. One look at my face told him something was wrong. As I stood there gasping for breath, he guided me inside and sat me down at the kitchen table. When I had calmed enough to speak, I told him everything. I expected disbelief, perhaps even anger at my disobedience in going out alone. But my father listened in silence, his face growing grave as I recounted my terrifying experience. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Son," he said, "the woods hold more secrets than we know. You must never go into them alone." Those words stuck with me, shaping my relationship with the forest for the rest of my life. I continued to hunt, to explore the woods that had been such an integral part of my childhood, but I never again ventured into them alone. Even now, decades later, I can still hear that laughter when I close my eyes. It echoes in my dreams, a reminder of the day I learned that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces that defy explanation. Some might dismiss my experience as the overactive imagination of a young boy, or perhaps a prank gone too far. But I know what I heard that day. I know the fear I felt, the evil I sensed lurking in those familiar woods. And so I pass this story on, a warning to those who might be tempted to underestimate the wild places of the world. Respect the woods, for they are ancient and powerful, and never venture into them alone. As I've grown older, I've often reflected on that day, trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched local legends, spoken with other hunters and outdoorsmen, even consulted with experts in various fields. While I've never found a definitive explanation for what I experienced, I've come to realize that perhaps the not knowing is part of the point. The woods, and indeed the world at large, are full of mysteries. As humans, we like to think we've tamed the wild, that we understand all there is to know about our environment. But my experience taught me the folly of such thinking. There are things out there that defy our understanding, forces that operate beyond the realm of what we consider normal or possible. This realization has shaped my life in many ways. It's made me more cautious, certainly, but also more open-minded. I've learned to listen when others share their own inexplicable experiences, to withhold judgment, and instead offer understanding. Because I know firsthand how it feels to encounter something that shakes your understanding of reality to its core. Over the years, I've returned to those woods many times. Each visit brings a mix of emotions: nostalgia for the carefree days of my youth, respect for the raw power of nature, and yes, a lingering fear of what might be lurking just beyond the next tree. But I've never again heard that laughter, never felt that overwhelming sense of malevolent presence. Sometimes I wonder if whatever was out there that day has moved on, or if it's still there, waiting. Other times I question whether it was ever really there at all, or if it was some manifestation of my own fears and insecurities. But then I remember the visceral terror I felt, the way the very air seemed to vibrate with that unearthly laughter, and I know that what I experienced was real, regardless of whether I can explain it or not. I've passed this story down to my own children, just as my father passed down his wisdom to me. I've taught them to respect the woods, to understand that nature is not just a playground or a resource to be exploited, but a force to be reckoned with. I've instilled in them the importance of preparation, of never taking unnecessary risks, and of always having a buddy when venturing into the wild. But more than that, I've tried to teach them about the balance between healthy skepticism and open-mindedness. I want them to question, to seek explanations, but also to be willing to accept that sometimes there are no easy answers. That sometimes the most honest response to the inexplicable is simply to acknowledge it and learn from it. As I near the end of my life, I find myself drawn more and more to those woods, not out of some morbid fascination or desire to confront whatever it was I encountered that day. Rather, I feel a need to make peace with it, to acknowledge that this experience, as terrifying as it was, has been a defining part of my life. I still hunt, though these days it's more about the connection with nature than actually bagging game, and I still never go alone. But now, when I walk those familiar trails, I feel a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The fear is still there, a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface, but it no longer controls me. Instead, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I learned that day, for the wisdom my father shared, and for the life I've been able to live because of those things. I'm grateful for the reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, that there is always more to learn and discover. And so, as I sit here recounting this story one more time, I do so not to frighten or to warn, but to share a piece of my truth, to pass on the lesson that has been the guiding principle of my life. Respect the unknown, prepare for the unexpected, And never underestimate the power of the wild places of the world. For in those places, in the depths of the woods or the heights of the mountains, or the vastness of the oceans, we are reminded of our place in the grand scheme of things. We are reminded that we are not masters of this world, but merely a part of it. And in that reminder lies both terror and wonder, fear and awe. It's a lesson I learned on that autumn morning so many years ago, with the sound of unearthly laughter echoing through the trees. A lesson that has stayed with me through all the years since, shaping the man I became and the life I've lived. And it's a lesson I hope will continue to be passed down from generation to generation, not as a ghost story or a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the vast, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying world we inhabit. A reminder to always keep our minds open, our senses alert, and our respect for the unknown intact. Because out there, in the wild places of the world, there are still secrets waiting to be discovered. And who knows? Maybe someday, someone will find an explanation for what I experienced that day. Until then, I'll continue to tell my story, to share my experience, and to remind others that sometimes the most profound truths are found in the things we can't explain. As I finish recounting this tale, I'm struck by how vivid the memories still are, how fresh the emotions. Time may have dimmed the sharp edges of fear, but it hasn't erased the impact of that day. If anything, the passing years have only deepened my appreciation for the experience and the lessons it taught me. I often wonder about others who might have had similar encounters in those woods, or in other wild places around the world. Are there others out there who have heard that chilling laughter, felt that oppressive presence? I've never shared my story widely, fearing disbelief or ridicule. But perhaps by opening up about my experience, I might encourage others to share theirs. There's a comfort in knowing you're not alone, in finding others who have glimpsed behind the veil of everyday reality and seen something they can't explain. It doesn't make the experience any less terrifying, but it does make it easier to bear. As I look out my window at the edge of those woods, still as dark and mysterious as they were all those years ago, I'm filled with a mix of emotions. There's still that lingering fear, a respect for the unknown that will never leave me. But there's also a sense of connection, a feeling that I'm part of something larger than myself. Those woods and the experience I had in them have been a constant presence in my life. They've been a source of fear, yes, but also of strength. They've taught me about resilience, about facing the unknown with courage. They've shown me that there's more to this world than what we can see or touch or easily explain. And in the end, isn't that what life is all about? Facing our fears, embracing the unknown, and growing from our experiences, no matter how terrifying they might be. So as I sit here, an old man now with a lifetime of experiences behind me, I find myself grateful for that day in the woods, grateful for the fear, for the mystery, for the lesson in humility it provided. Because without that day, without that inexplicable encounter, I might never have truly understood the vastness and wonder of the world around us. To anyone reading this, I say, respect the wild places, prepare for the unexpected, keep an open mind but also a healthy dose of caution, and above all, remember that there are still mysteries in this world, still experiences that defy explanation. Who knows? Maybe someday you'll have your own encounter with the unexplained, and if you do, remember my story. Remember that you're not alone, and remember that sometimes the most profound truths come not from what we can explain, but from what we can't. As for me, I'll continue to visit those woods, to walk those familiar trails. And each time I do, I'll remember that day, that laughter, and the lessons it taught me. I'll carry the memory with me, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, the explained and the inexplicable. In recent years, I've taken to bringing my grandchildren into these woods, not to the exact spot where I had my encounter, I've never been able to pinpoint that location again, as if the forest itself had rearranged to hide its secrets. But I bring them to the edges, to the safer trails, and I teach them about respect for nature and the importance of preparedness. I see in their eyes the same wonder I once had, the same eagerness to explore and discover. But I also make sure they understand the potential dangers, both natural and otherwise. I tell them my story, not to frighten them, but to instill in them a healthy respect for the unknown. Some of them believe me outright, their young minds still open to the possibility of the unexplained. Others are more skeptical, products of a more rational, scientific age. But even the doubters listen intently, perhaps sensing the truth in my voice, the genuine fear that still lingers after all these years. I've often wondered if I'll ever encounter that presence again. Part of me hopes I won't, that whatever it was has long since moved on or faded away. But another part, a part I'm not always comfortable acknowledging, almost wishes for one more encounter. One more chance to face that fear, to perhaps understand what it was that I experienced that day. But I know better than to go looking for it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some experiences are meant to remain unexplained, serving as reminders of the vast unknown that surrounds us. As I write these words, I can hear the wind rustling through the trees outside my window. It's a sound that used to fill me with dread, especially on dark nights when the memory of that laughter seemed to echo in every gust. Now, though, it's almost comforting, a reminder of the wild, untamed nature that exists just beyond our doorstep. I've come to see my experience as a gift, in a way, a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, a peek into the vast unknown that surrounds us. It's shaped my life, my beliefs, my very understanding of the world. And while I wouldn't wish the terror of that day on anyone, I'm grateful for the perspective it's given me. To those who might read this and scoff, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old man or the product of an overactive imagination, I say this: I hope you never have to face what I faced that day. I hope you never have to confront something that shakes the very foundations of your reality. But if you do, remember my story. Remember that you're not alone in facing the unexplained. And to those who might have had their own brushes with the unknown, who have faced their own inexplicable terrors, I say, you're not crazy. Your experiences are valid, even if they defy explanation. Don't let anyone dismiss your truth. As I near the end of my life, I find a certain peace in knowing that there are still mysteries in this world. That despite all our advancements, all our technology and science, there are still things that defy our understanding. It gives me hope that the world will always have the capacity to surprise us, to fill us with wonder and, yes, sometimes with fear. I don't know what awaits us beyond this life. Perhaps all will be revealed, and I'll finally understand what happened to me that day in the woods. Or perhaps the mystery will remain, extending even beyond the veil of death. Either way, I face the future with the same mix of trepidation and curiosity that has defined my life since that fateful day. To the woods that have been both my terror and my teacher, I offer my respect and my gratitude. To whatever force or entity I encountered that day, I offer my acknowledgement. You changed me, shaped me, taught me lessons I've carried throughout my life. And to those who come after me, who might walk those same trails or face their own unexplained phenomena, I offer this advice. Be prepared, be respectful, and above all, be open to the possibility that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. The woods are calling as they always have, and even now, in my twilight years, I feel the pull to answer. So I'll lace up my boots, check my supplies, and step once more into the embrace of the forest. For in those wild places in the depths of the unknown, I've found not just fear, but also profound truth and an enduring sense of wonder. The laughter may be gone, but its echo remains. And in that echo, I've found a lifetime of meaning, a wellspring of respect for the mysteries that surround us, and a deep appreciation for the delicate balance between the known and the unknown. As I close this account, I'm reminded of the words my father spoke to me all those years ago. The woods hold more secrets than we know. How right he was, and how grateful I am to have been given a glimpse of those secrets, terrifying though it may have been. So I'll end with this. Respect the woods, for they are ancient and powerful. Embrace the unknown, for in it lies the potential for growth and understanding. And never, ever, venture into the wild places alone, for you never know what might be waiting just beyond the next tree, ready to challenge everything you think you know about the world. The laughter may have faded, but the lesson remains. And it's a lesson I'll carry with me into whatever adventure awaits beyond this life. There's something about the vast expanse of America's wilderness that defies easy explanation. I should know. I've spent my entire life traversing its deep forests, wandering its endless deserts, and scaling its ancient mountains across multiple states. The land has a way of showing you things that challenge your understanding of reality. I've heard inexplicable sounds echoing through dense woods at midnight, witnessed mysterious lights dancing across desert horizons, and encountered phenomena that defy rational explanation. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what I now call the ghost station incident. This particular story began about 3 years ago, though the memory remains as crisp as yesterday's sunrise. My partner and I were making our way back from a week-long Colorado adventure, cruising through western Nebraska under a crystalline afternoon sky. The sun hung high and bright, casting sharp shadows across the endless prairie, and the interstate stretched before us like a ribbon of possibility. It was the kind of day that makes you believe in the simplicity of things: blue skies, open roads, and straightforward destinations. I-80 through Nebraska is a highway I know as intimately as the lines on my palm. I've driven it countless times, memorized every exit, every truck stop, every quirk of the landscape. It's the kind of familiar that makes any deviation stand out like a thunderclap on a clear day. We were running low on gas, not critically low, but enough to make the next exit sign a welcome sight. The blue service marker advertised a gas station, and we pulled off, following a connector road about a quarter-mile from the interstate. What we found wasn't one of the typical corporate truck stops that dot I-80 like clockwork. Instead, we came upon what looked more like someone's converted farmhouse, a small gray structure that seemed to have been plucked from a different era. 2 ancient gas pumps stood sentinel outside, their dated designs suggesting they'd witnessed decades of travelers passing through. My partner opted to stay in the car while I filled up, probably scrolling through their phone, blissfully unaware of the strangeness we were about to encounter. The pump worked normally enough, though, thinking back, I can't recall if it made the usual digital beeping sounds or displayed the typical LED readout. These details have become frustratingly hazy in my memory, like trying to recall the specifics of a dream that slips away upon waking. What I do remember with startling clarity is what happened when I went inside to pay. The interior of the station defied every expectation of a rural American gas stop. The first thing that struck me was the absence of drink coolers, those humming walls of glass-doored refrigerators that are as much a part of gas station architecture as the pumps themselves. Instead, there were only shelves of room-temperature bottled water. But it was the snack selection that truly catapulted this experience into the realm of the bizarre. Where you'd expect to find the familiar logos of American snack food giants, your Lay's chips, Snickers bars, and gas station beef jerky, the shelves were stocked exclusively with brands I recognized from trips to the British Isles. These weren't just a few imported items as a novelty. Every single product was from Ireland, Scotland, or England. The packaging bore those distinct designs and brand names that seemed slightly out of place in Middle America, like artifacts from a parallel universe where the colonial relationship had somehow reversed. At the time, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps this was some quirky business owner's attempt at creating a unique roadside attraction, a little slice of the British Isles in the heart of Nebraska. It seemed odd, but no odder than the countless other roadside oddities that dot America's highways. I purchased some snacks, paid for my gas, though I now realize I can't clearly remember the transaction or the person who must have processed it, and we continued our journey home. The true strangeness of the encounter didn't fully register until later that year, when I made the same drive with my father during spring break. As someone who makes this Colorado trip once or twice annually, I have the route memorized down to the mile markers. I knew exactly where to look for the exit, and I had even told my father the story of the unusual gas station as we approached the area. But the exit wasn't there. Not just the gas station. The entire exit had vanished as if it had never existed. The landscape flowed uninterrupted past our windows, with no sign of the connector road, no indication that anything had ever broken the continuous stretch of prairie grass and farmland. We made the return trip a week later with the same result. Nothing. No exit, no gray house-turned gas station, no hint of the bizarre British snack oasis we had encountered. This wasn't a one-time anomaly. 4 subsequent trips yielded the same result. An unbroken stretch of highway where my memory insisted there should be an exit. I've spent countless hours poring over Google Maps, examining every exit along I-80 in western Nebraska. I've searched for any sign of that small gray building with its ancient pumps and its impossible inventory. Nothing. The experience has left me with questions that seem to multiply rather than resolve. Where exactly were we that afternoon? What kind of fuel did I put in my car? How did we find our way to a place that seems to exist outside the normal boundaries of reality? The only tangible proof I have that it wasn't all a dream is the memory of those British snacks, delicious treats that I can still taste if I close my eyes and concentrate hard enough. There's a peculiar melancholy in knowing that somewhere out there, perhaps existing in some fold of reality we can't quite grasp, is a perfect little gas station that I'll never visit again. It's not the fear of the unknown that haunts me. It's the strange sense of loss, like missing a place you've only visited in a dream. Those imported snacks, with their unfamiliar packaging and distinctive flavors, have become a sort of touchstone in my memory, a proof that something truly extraordinary occurred that sunny Nebraska afternoon. I've spent countless hours researching similar phenomena since then. The internet is full of stories about phantom roads, vanishing locations, and places that seem to exist only for a moment before dissolving back into the fabric of reality. They're often dismissed as fabrications or mistakes, but there's a pattern to them that feels significant. Many occur along America's vast highway systems, in those stretched out spaces between destinations where the monotony of travel can make time feel elastic. The details of our stop have become more puzzling with each passing year. I remember the gray building clearly, its weathered siding, the slight tilt to its front porch, the way it seemed both perfectly ordinary and subtly wrong at the same time. But other details shift and blur when I try to focus on them. Was there a name on the station? I must have seen one, must have read it when we pulled in, but it slides away from my memory like water through cupped hands. The British snacks present another layer of mystery. These weren't just generic items with foreign labels. They were specific brands I later recognized when traveling abroad. Walker's Crisps instead of Lay's, Cadbury chocolates with flavors you can't find in American stores, savory biscuits and crackers that would be completely out of place in a typical Nebraska gas station. Some of these products weren't even being exported to America at the time. How did they end up on those shelves? My partner remembers the stop differently. They recall pulling off the highway and waiting in the car, but their memory of the building is hazy, almost dreamlike. When I've asked about specific details, the color of the building, the style of the pumps, their answers change slightly each time, as if they're trying to describe something seen through frosted glass. Yet they remember the snacks I brought back to the car, can describe their taste and packaging with perfect clarity. The fuel is another puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. Our car ran perfectly after that stop, made it all the way home without any issues. But when I check my credit card statements from that period, there's no charge from any gas station in Nebraska on that day. It's as if the transaction occurred outside of normal financial channels, in some parallel economy that doesn't leave digital footprints. I've tried to calculate exactly where the station should have been based on our timing and fuel consumption. We had filled up in Colorado before leaving, and I know roughly how many miles we could travel on a tank. The GO station must have been somewhere between North Platte and Kearney, but that stretch of I-80 is now maddeningly familiar and completely devoid of any location matching my memory. Local historical societies haven't been much help either. I've checked records of defunct gas stations along that stretch of highway, looking for any mention of a British-themed stop or even just a small, gray, house-like structure. Nothing matches. One elderly librarian in North Platte did mention old stories about shifty places along the highway, locations that seemed to appear and disappear depending on when you drove past, but she dismissed them as local legends, the kind of tales that spring up anywhere roads stretch toward the horizon. The more I think about it, the more I wonder about the nature of reality itself. We tend to think of the world as solid, fixed, unchangeable. But what if there are places where the boundaries between different versions of reality become thin? What if, just occasionally, we can slip through these boundaries without even realizing it? The gas station might still exist, just not in our version of Nebraska, not in our particular timeline. What makes this experience particularly unsettling isn't just the disappearance of the station itself, but the way it seems to challenge everything we assume about the stability of our world. We're taught that places don't simply vanish, that reality is consistent and measurable. Yet here was a location that seemed to exist in a pocket of displaced time and space, complete with its own internal logic and physical presence, only to disappear without a trace. The timing of it all feels significant somehow. It was mid-afternoon when we stopped, that peculiar hour when the sun hangs heavy in the sky and shadows can play tricks on your eyes. Some paranormal researchers suggest this is a thin time, a period when the boundaries between realities might be more permeable. The clear, sunny day itself might have been important too. There was no storm, no fog, none of the atmospheric conditions usually associated with strange phenomena. Perhaps that very normalcy was what made the slip between worlds possible. I've developed theories over the years, each one seeming both more and less plausible than the last. Maybe we encountered some kind of retail wormhole, a connection to a world where British goods naturally populated Nebraska gas stations. Or perhaps we stumbled upon a place that exists in multiple times simultaneously, a station that was once there, will be there, or exists there in some alternate timeline where America's colonial history played out differently. The question of the fuel itself continues to nag at me. Our car ran perfectly on whatever we pumped into it that day, but what exactly was it? Did we fill up with gasoline from another reality? The implications are both fascinating and slightly terrifying. If matter can cross between worlds so seamlessly, what does that say about the nature of physical reality itself? What strikes me most now, looking back, is the sheer ordinariness of how it all felt in the moment. There was nothing overtly supernatural about the experience. No flickering lights, no mysterious figures, no sense of danger or otherworldliness. It was just a slightly odd gas station that happened to stock British snacks. The true strangeness only became apparent in retrospect when the place refused to exist where it clearly had been. The snacks themselves have become almost mythical in my memory. I've tracked down some of the same brands in international food stores, but they never taste quite the same as they did that day. It's as if those original treats carried with them some essence of their impossible origin, some flavor of the inexplicable that can't be replicated in our normal reality. I still watch for that exit every time I drive through Nebraska. Part of me hopes to find it again, to prove to myself that it wasn't all some elaborate shared delusion. But another part of me wonders if finding it again would somehow diminish the mystery. Perhaps some experiences are meant to be singular, brief glimpses behind the curtain of reality that we're not meant to repeat. The American highway system itself seems to invite these kinds of anomalies. There's something about the long stretches of road, the hypnotic rhythm of white lines passing beneath your wheels, the way distance and time begin to blur together. Maybe these conditions create perfect circumstances for reality to hiccup, for the walls between worlds to temporarily thin. I've learned to embrace the uncertainty of it all. The Ghost Station has become a personal reminder that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we typically allow ourselves to believe. In an age where almost everything can be Googled, mapped, and explained, there's something refreshing about encountering a mystery that defies our modern tools of investigation. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving lonely stretches of highway, I find myself watching more carefully for exits that shouldn't be there, for places that might exist in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. The Ghost Station taught me that reality might be more flexible than we imagine, that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences can be wrapped in the most ordinary packaging. The experience has changed how I view travel itself. Every journey now carries with it the possibility of stumbling upon something impossible, something that exists outside our normal understanding of the world. I've become more attentive to details that seem slightly out of place, more open to the possibility that not everything needs or wants to be explained. And sometimes when I'm driving through Nebraska and the afternoon sun hits just right, I catch myself looking for that familiar gray building with its ancient pumps. Not because I expect to find it again, but because its very absence has become a kind of presence in itself. A reminder that some of the best stories are the ones we can never fully explain, the mysteries that refuse to be solved. Perhaps that's the real gift of the Ghost Station. Not just the memory of an impossible place, but the awareness that our world still holds secrets, that reality itself might be more malleable than we imagine. In an age of GPS coordinates and satellite imagery, there's something profoundly comforting about knowing that some places can still slip through the cracks of our carefully mapped world, appearing and disappearing like mirages on the edge of perception. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there in the vast tapestry of possible realities, that little gray station still stands, its shelves still stocked with British snacks, waiting for other travelers to stumble upon its impossible existence. Omaha rises from the western banks of the Missouri River like a testament to American industrialization, its skyline a mix of modern glass and century-old brick. The city has worn many faces throughout its nearly 170 years, but none quite as gritty and authentic as South Omaha, a district that once pulsed with the lifeblood of the meatpacking industry and the dreams of Eastern European immigrants who made it their home. The ethnic neighborhoods that sprouted around the slaughterhouses became vibrant communities. Poles, Czechs, Germans, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and Croatians, all carving out their piece of the American dream amid the steam and noise of the processing plants. Though most of the massive feedlots are gone now, their ghosts linger in the architecture, in the street names, in the very soil of South Omaha. One building in particular had always captured my imagination, a mammoth slaughterhouse that stretched alongside the railroad tracks that bisect South Omaha like a steel spine. The structure was a monster of industrial architecture, 5 stories of red and white brick rising from the prairie soil, extending the length of 3 football fields. It stood as a silent colossus, a reminder of the district's bloody, prosperous past. When I heard about its impending demolition, something inside me broke. I'd spent years admiring these old buildings from a distance, fascinated by urban exploration, but too cautious to actually attempt it. But the news of its scheduled destruction felt like a now or never moment. If I didn't see inside those walls before they fell, I'd regret it forever. I chose a crisp fall evening for my expedition, loading up my truck with a heavy-duty LED mag light and dressing in lightweight hiking gear that wouldn't draw attention. The slaughterhouse complex lay in one of South Omaha's more desolate areas, surrounded by other abandoned structures wearing the same red and white brick uniform, all encompassed by chain-link fencing that had seen better days. Parking my truck on a quiet side street near a garage, I approached the fence on foot. The building's true scale became apparent as I drew closer. It was more than just large. It was mythological in its proportions. The fence, mercifully free of barbed wire, proved an easy enough obstacle to overcome. But the moment my feet touched the ground on the other side, something shifted in the air around me. It wasn't just normal trespassing jitters or urban explorers' excitement. This was something deeper, more primordial, a sensation that felt less like fear and more like recognition, as if some ancient part of my brain was acknowledging that I had crossed a boundary I shouldn't have. The entrance I found was a weathered door with a dirt-streaked window beside it. Whatever corporate identity had once been emblazoned there had long since surrendered to time and elements, leaving only ghost traces of lettering. The handle resisted my first attempt, but the door itself felt loose in its frame. With a few determined shoulder strikes, the lock gave way, a transgression I justified with the building's imminent fate. The beam of my maglite cut through decades of darkness, revealing a vast processing floor that stretched away into shadow. Ancient machinery squatted in the gloom like sleeping monsters, conveyor belts snaking through the space like fossilized serpents. Control stations and administrative desks stood abandoned at their posts, everything draped in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs that suggested years of perfect isolation. The tile walls and floors spoke to the building's original purpose, designed for easy cleaning of what must have been constant gore. I made my way carefully through the mechanical maze until I reached a set of heavy double doors. As I pushed them open, the atmosphere underwent a sudden dramatic transformation. The temperature plummeted as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer, dropping well below the mild 65-degree evening outside. There was no wind, no obvious source for this pocket of winter that seemed to exist only in this room. The cold had a presence to it, a weight that felt almost conscious. This new space was clearly the killing floor, the main throughway for cattle still visible in the architectural layout, with auxiliary conveyor systems branching off like tributaries of an industrial river. But it was the smell that stopped me in my tracks. Growing up near stockyards, I was intimately familiar with the various aromas of the cattle industry: manure, burned hair, rendered fat. This was something else entirely. The stench that assaulted my nostrils was primordial, not the simple organic decay of dead matter, but something deeper and wrong, a smell that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum of earthly decomposition. It triggered ancient warning systems in my brain, the same instincts that tell us not to enter caves or drink from stagnant water. I'd read accounts of similar odors associated with supernatural entities, wendigos, skinwalkers, but had always dismissed them as creative flourishes. Now I wasn't so sure. I tried to rationalize it as a dead raccoon or feral cat, but my mind rejected these comfortable explanations. This smell didn't belong in our world. It was as if something had torn a hole in reality, and this odor was seeping through from somewhere else. Then came the bellow. It wasn't just loud, it was reality shaking, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It had the basic structure of a bull's cry, but twisted and wrong, more like a scream of rage and pain combined. The volume was impossible, reverberating through the massive space with such force that I felt it in my bones. Sweeping my flashlight beam across the room, I searched frantically for the source of that otherworldly cry, but the shadows seemed to swallow the light. I pressed forward, driven by a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, until I reached the far end of the killing floor. Here, the tiles gleamed with an unnatural sheen, as if they'd been recently cleaned. Large plastic bins on industrial wheels were lined up with military precision against the wall. What I found in those bins defied all logic and natural law. They were filled to the brim with cattle bones, not ancient dry remains, but fresh bones still wet with blood. The impossibility of this discovery froze me in place. The slaughterhouse had been abandoned for nearly 4 decades. These bones should have been dust, yet they looked like they'd been stripped of flesh mere hours ago. The floor around the bins was slick with fresh blood, creating crimson puddles that reflected my flashlight beam like dark mirrors. As I stepped back in horror, my boot nearly slid out from under me on the wet tile. That's when I saw it. A faint light emanating from one of the doorways at the far end of the room. Within that glow, 2 red eyes materialized in the darkness, floating at about the height of a large bull's head. I leaned forward involuntarily, drawn by a terrible curiosity. The second bellow that followed was even more devastating than the first, and this time I could hear the distinctive sound of hooves on tile, moving with deliberate purpose in my direction. The red eyes began to advance, and whatever rational thought remained in my mind screamed at me to run. I bolted through the nearest door and found myself in a corridor lined with gleaming tile, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I ran. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the perspective somehow wrong, as if the space itself was warped. I finally reached a doorway covered with the kind of rubber strip curtains you'd see in a modern meat locker. Pushing through those strips, I froze at a sight that challenged every concept of reality I'd ever held. Under the dim red glow of an ancient bulb, 3 men in white smocks were processing a cow carcass. They wore old-style safety helmets, goggles, and rubber boots, but it was their movements that caught my attention. The way they worked was too smooth, too practiced, as if they were performing a ritual they'd done countless times over countless years. The workers moved with mechanical precision, one spraying down the carcass, another making precise cuts, the third transferring bones to a bin identical to those I'd seen earlier. But it was their conversation that made my blood run cold. They were speaking Polish, the same language I'd heard my grandfather use, but their voices had an otherworldly quality, as if the words were coming from very far away or from no particular direction at all. I tried to edge past them, clinging to the wall like a shadow. Perhaps if I moved quietly enough. But then all movement in the room ceased. As one, they turned to face me, their movements unnaturally synchronized. Under the crimson light, 3 pairs of goggled eyes fixed on my position. One of them barked something in Polish. The words were familiar yet somehow wrong, like hearing a beloved song played backwards. The moment they began moving toward me, I saw something that turned my fear into pure, primal terror. Behind their goggles, their eyes had begun to glow with the same red light I'd seen in the darkness earlier. These weren't just ghostly remnants of long-dead workers. They were something else entirely, something wearing the shapes of men who had once worked these killing floors. I ran. The sound of their boots on the tile behind me echoed through the corridors, but their movements were hampered by their heavy work gear. The layout of the building seemed to shift as I fled, corridors extending and contracting in impossible ways. Finally, I spotted an exterior door and slammed through it with my shoulder, emerging into the cool night air on the opposite side of the building from where I'd entered. The street lay tantalizingly close, just beyond the western edge of the lot. My truck was parked there, promising safety and escape. As I paused to catch my breath and get my bearings, some terrible instinct made me look back at the building. There, framed in an open loading dock, stood the three figures. In the natural light, their true nature was more apparent. Their forms seemed to flicker and shift, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. But their eyes burned with that same impossible red light. A final bellow shattered the night, so powerful it felt like a physical blow to my eardrums. This wasn't just the cry of some spectral bull. It was the voice of the building itself, of all the death and suffering that had seeped into its very foundations over decades of operation. It was the collective scream of every animal that had met its end on those blood-soaked tiles. I ran for my truck with everything I had left, fumbling with my keys as another earth-shaking bellow rolled across the empty streets of South Omaha. The engine roared to life, and I accelerated away from that cursed place, watching in my rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The building receded into the darkness, but I could still feel those red eyes watching me go. That was my first and last urban exploration. In the weeks that followed, I dove deep into research about the old slaughterhouse and its history. I found stories about accidents, about workers who disappeared during shifts, about strange sounds that would emanate from the building even after it closed. The Polish community in South Omaha had their own legends about the place, whispered tales of something that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human, something that had taken up residence in the killing floors. What I encountered that night defies conventional explanation. Were those figures glimpses of some eternal moment, forever repeating in that blood-soaked building? Were they something darker, entities that had been drawn to decades of death and suffering, wearing the forms of long-dead workers? And what was the thing with the red eyes, the source of that impossible bellowing? The building was demolished 3 weeks later. I drove past once during the destruction and saw the wrecking crews at work. Something about their body language suggested they'd seen things too, the way they kept looking over their shoulders, how they worked faster than seemed necessary, as if they couldn't wait to be done with the job. Some theories suggest that places where great violence or suffering has occurred can become thin spots in reality, places where the barrier between our world and others becomes permeable. If that's true, then what happens when such a place is destroyed? Do the entities that dwelled there simply cease to exist, or do they migrate elsewhere? I still drive through South Omaha occasionally, past the empty lot where the slaughterhouse once stood. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think I can still hear a faint bellowing in the distance. And sometimes, when I glance in my rearview mirror, I catch a glimpse of something red glowing in the darkness, like eyes watching me pass, waiting to see if I'll ever be foolish enough to stop again. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Growing up in Colorado, I spent every free moment exploring the Rocky Mountains, breathing in the crisp mountain air and losing myself in the vast expanses of untamed nature. School never held my interest the way the outdoors did. While my classmates pored over textbooks, I was busy learning the language of the forest, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant cry of an eagle soaring overhead. At 18, fresh out of high school with no clear direction, I found myself drawn to the structure and promise of adventure offered by the military. The Army seemed like a natural fit for someone like me, someone who craved challenge and thrived in rugged environments. Little did I know that my love for the wilderness and my newfound military career would converge in a way I never could have imagined in the heart of Oklahoma's Wichita Mountains. Fort Sill, my first duty station, was a far cry from the towering peaks of my Colorado home. The landscape was different, rolling prairies punctuated by ancient granite mountains, weathered by time into craggy outcrops and mysterious boulder fields. But there was a raw beauty to it, a sense of history etched into every rock and gnarled oak tree. In those early days at Fort Sill, I threw myself into training with the same enthusiasm I'd always had for outdoor pursuits. The physical demands were grueling, but I relished the challenge. Ruck marches across rugged terrain, land navigation exercises in dense thickets, and long nights spent under the stars. It all fed that primal part of me that longed for connection with the natural world. But there was something else about Fort Sill, something that set it apart from other military installations I'd heard about. Whispers and legends circulated among the soldiers, passed down from one cycle of recruits to the next. Stories of strange sightings in the surrounding wilderness, unexplained noises echoing across the artillery ranges at night, shadows that seemed to move of their own accord in the peripheral vision of exhausted sentries. Most of the older soldiers laughed these tales off as the overactive imaginations of sleep-deprived privates. Ghost stories to keep the new guys on their toes, they'd say with a knowing smirk. But there was always an undercurrent of unease, a sense that even the most hardened veterans weren't entirely comfortable with the idea of being alone in certain parts of the post after dark. I listened to these stories with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Growing up in Colorado, I'd heard my fair share of Native American folklore tales of skinwalkers and wind spirits that haunted the mountains. I'd always viewed them as interesting cultural artifacts, bits of oral tradition passed down through generations, but I'd never given them much credence as literal truth. Still, on my first few night watches at Fort Sill, I couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease as I gazed out into the darkness beyond the floodlights. The Wichita Mountains loomed in the distance, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-studded Oklahoma sky. In those quiet hours, with only the soft hum of distant generators and the occasional call of a coyote to break the silence, it was easy to let the mind wander to unsettling places. I told myself it was just the natural apprehension of being in an unfamiliar place, amplified by the heightened alertness that came with military training. But deep down, a part of me wondered if there might be more to the stories than mere campfire tales. Little did I know that I was about to embark on an experience that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. The day of our week-long field training exercise dawned crisp and clear, the October air carrying just a hint of the winter to come. As our convoy of vehicles rumbled out of Fort Sill and into the sprawling wilderness of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, I felt a familiar surge of excitement. This was what I'd signed up for, the chance to test my skills in a real-world environment, to push my limits and prove my worth as a soldier. Our unit, an artillery battery, had been tasked with setting up a remote firing position deep within the refuge. It was a complex operation, involving the coordination of multiple teams to transport and position our massive howitzers, establish secure communications, and create a defensible perimeter. As a junior specialist, my role was primarily to follow orders and provide support wherever needed. The first few hours were a flurry of activity. The air filled with the rumble of engines, the metallic clang of equipment being unloaded, and the constant chatter of radio communications. Dust kicked up by our vehicles hung in the air, creating a hazy atmosphere that seemed to blur the boundaries between the familiar world of military precision and the wild, untamed landscape that surrounded us. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across our makeshift camp, a sense of accomplishment settled over the unit. Our howitzers stood ready, their long barrels pointed towards distant, unseen targets. Camouflage netting had been expertly draped over vehicles and sensitive equipment, breaking up their outlines and helping them blend into the rugged terrain. The command post buzzed with activity as officers pored over maps and discussed the next day's training scenarios. With the bulk of the setup complete, our platoon sergeant began assigning night watch rotations. When he called my name and paired me with Corporal Jenkins for the midnight to 4 o'clock shift, I felt a mix of anticipation and slight apprehension. Night watches were always a test of mental fortitude. Fighting off fatigue, staying alert in the face of mind-numbing boredom, and battling the tricks that darkness can play on an overstimulated imagination. As twilight faded into true night, the mood in the camp shifted. Conversations became more hushed, laughter less frequent. The daytime bustle gave way to a tense quietude, broken only by the soft crackle of radio checks and the occasional cough or shuffle of boots on rocky ground. In the distance, the silhouettes of the Wichita Mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their presence somehow more palpable in the darkness. I busied myself with final preparations for the long night ahead, checking the charge on my radio, adjusting the red lens on my headlamp, and triple-checking that my M4 carbine was clean and ready for use if needed. As I worked, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague feeling that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the unfamiliar terrain, so different from the mountain forests I'd grown up in. Or perhaps it was the weight of all those stories I'd heard back on post tales of strange encounters and inexplicable phenomena out here in the wilderness. Whatever the cause, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, as full darkness settled over our position. As I zipped up my jacket against the growing chill, Corporal Jenkins approached, his weathered face illuminated by the ember of his ever-present cigarette. "Ready for a wild night, Specialist?" he asked, a hint of sarcasm in his gravelly voice. I nodded, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Yes, Corporal, all set." He studied me for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "First time out here, isn't it? Word of advice, keep your wits about you. This place, it's got a way of playing tricks on you, especially at night. Stick to the established patrol routes, maintain radio contact, and for God's sake, don't go wandering off into those woods unless you absolutely have to. Understood?" "Yes, Corporal," I replied, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature running down my spine. As Jenkins moved off to brief the other members of our watch team, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the long hours ahead. The Wichita Mountains stretched out before me, a vast expanse of darkness broken only by the faint glimmer of starlight on granite outcrops. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew, lay challenges I couldn't yet imagine, tests of not just my training and physical endurance, but of my very perception of reality. With one last check of my gear, I stepped forward to assume my post, the first tentative steps into a night that would change everything. The first hour of our watch passed uneventfully. Corporal Jenkins and I patrolled the perimeter of our position, our boots crunching softly on the mix of gravel and scrub grass that covered the ground. The night was clear, the stars blazing with an intensity I'd rarely seen, even in the mountains of Colorado. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, casting just enough illumination to silhouette the jagged peaks around us. Despite the beauty of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that seemed to move in the corner of my eye, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I tried to rationalize it. We were in a wildlife refuge, after all. The sounds were probably just nocturnal animals going about their business, unperturbed by our military presence. Around 1 o'clock, Jenkins decided to split up to cover more ground. "You take the eastern perimeter," he said, gesturing towards a line of scrub oaks that marked the edge of our position. "I'll cover the west. Radio check every 15 minutes. And remember what I said. Stick to the patrol route." I nodded, squaring my shoulders and gripping my M4 a little tighter as I set off towards my assigned sector. The eastern perimeter skirted the edge of a dense thicket, the trees casting deep shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in my peripheral vision. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, scanning the area methodically, just as I'd been trained. As I walked, I found myself whistling softly, an old habit from my hiking days, a way to break the oppressive silence and announce my presence to any wildlife that might be startled by a human's sudden appearance. The tune that came to my lips was Colonel Bogey March, its jaunty melody incongruous with the tense atmosphere. I had just reached the furthest point of my patrol route when I heard it, a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. A cough. Not the bark of a coyote or the rustle of wind through leaves, but a distinctly human cough coming from the thicket to my right. My heart began to race. We weren't supposed to have any other units in this area. Could it be an infiltrator? Someone trying to test our perimeter security? Or worse, had someone from our unit wandered off and gotten lost? "Corporal Jenkins?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the vast night. "Is that you?" There was no response, just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the pounding of blood in my ears. I swept my rifle towards the source of the sound, flicking on my weapon light to illuminate the dense undergrowth. The beam cut through the darkness, casting stark shadows that seemed to dance and leap with a life of their own. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a random pattern of shadows and foliage that my stressed mind was interpreting as a human form. But as I focused, the shape became clearer, more defined. It was a figure, standing perhaps 20 feet away, partially obscured by a gnarled oak tree. The sight hit me like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to radio for help, to do something. But I stood frozen, my training warring with primal fear as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was dressed in what looked like a military uniform, but one that was decades out of date. Ragged and worn, hanging loosely on a frame that seemed simultaneously too thin and too tall to be natural. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. It was as if someone had taken features from a human and a deer and mashed them together in a nightmarish collage. The eyes were too large, too widely spaced, glowing with an unnatural reddish-brown light in the beam of my flashlight. The nose was elongated, almost snout-like, above a mouth that seemed to be fixed in a grimace of pain or hunger. As I stood there, paralyzed with shock and disbelief, the creature's gaze locked onto mine. There was intelligence in those eyes, a cold, calculating awareness that sent shivers down my spine. This was no animal, no trick of light and shadow. This was something else entirely. My eyes darted to the tattered name tape on its uniform, barely legible in the harsh light of my rifle-mounted flashlight. Thompson. The name burned itself into my brain, a bizarre detail that my mind latched onto in the midst of this surreal encounter. Finding my voice at last, I managed to stutter out a question. Who are you?" The response came not in words, but in a cacophony of sounds, animal cries, human voices, all layered together in a discordant echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And within that maelstrom of noise, I heard my own question repeated back to me, distorted and mocking. I began to back away slowly, my rifle still trained on the figure. "The corporal is at post," I said, the words tumbling out almost of their own accord as I gestured vaguely to my left, towards where I knew the main part of our camp lay. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature, Thompson, my mind insisted on calling it, remained motionless, those unnatural eyes still fixed on me. Then, without warning, it let out a scream that seemed to pierce through my very being. It was a sound of rage, of hunger, of otherworldly malevolence that defied description. In that instant, several things happened at once. The red light on my headlamp, which I had been using for navigation, suddenly flared to an impossible brightness. The air around me seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe, and my legs, finally breaking free from their paralysis, began to move of their own accord, carrying me backwards, away from the nightmare before me. I don't know how long I retreated like that, walking backwards with my rifle still aimed at the spot where I'd seen the creature. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a matter of minutes. Eventually, the glare of my headlamp began to fade, and with it, my last visual connection to the thing called Thompson. As soon as the red glow diminished enough for me to see properly, I turned and ran. I ran with a desperation I'd never known before, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the uneven ground that threatened to trip me with every step. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, driven by a primal fear that overrode all reason and training. I burst out of the tree line and into the clearing where we'd parked our vehicles, nearly colliding with Corporal Jenkins, who was leaning against the hood of a Humvee, cigarette in hand. He started at my sudden appearance, his hand instinctively moving towards his sidearm before he recognized me. "What the hell, Specialist?" he barked, his gruff exterior not quite masking the concern in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Gasping for breath, I set my M4 on the hood of the Humvee, my hands shaking so badly I was afraid I might drop it. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed over me. I looked at Jenkins, saw the mixture of annoyance and worry on his weathered face, and knew I had to try to explain. So I told him. I told him everything. The cough in the woods, the bizarre figure, the name on the uniform, the inhuman scream. As I spoke, I watched Jenkins's expression change from skepticism to something harder to read. He didn't interrupt, just listened silently, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line behind me. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence, broken only by the soft hiss of Jenkins's cigarette as he took a long, contemplative drag. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tight. "Specialist," Jenkins said, his voice barely above a whisper, "go wake the next shift, and don't go back into those woods." There was something in his tone that sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. It wasn't just the gruff command of a superior to a subordinate. There was an undercurrent of, what? Fear? Understanding? I couldn't quite place it, but it was clear that my story had affected him more deeply than he was letting on. As I moved to follow his order, Jenkins sprang into action. With a speed and precision that spoke of years of experience, he maneuvered the Humvee, positioning it between us and the tree line where I had encountered whatever it was I had seen. The heavy vehicle seemed like a flimsy barrier against the horrors that lurked in the darkness, but its presence was nonetheless reassuring. I made my way through our makeshift camp, rousing the next watch shift. My fellow soldiers grumbled and cursed as they emerged from their sleeping bags, but I barely registered their complaints. My mind was still reeling, trying to make sense of what had happened. As I moved from one soldier to the next, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of wind through the scrub oaks sounded like that unearthly cough. By the time I had finished waking everyone, Jenkins had taken up position in the Humvee's turret, his watchful gaze fixed on the woods. As I approached, he looked down at me, his face half illuminated by the soft glow of his cigarette. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw in his expression a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher: concern, fear, and something that looked almost like resignation. "Get some rest, Specialist," he said gruffly. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I cast one last glance at the tree line. The Wichita Mountains loomed beyond, their jagged silhouettes a stark reminder of how small and vulnerable we were out here. Somewhere in those shadows I knew something waited, something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. In my dreams I wandered endless forests, pursued by a figure that was always just out of sight. The name Thompson echoed through my subconscious, a mocking refrain that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. I woke several times, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air, the image of those inhuman eyes burning in my mind. The first light of dawn found me already awake, staring at the canvas roof of my tent. As the camp began to stir around me, I lay there, trying to make sense of the previous night's events. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed so implausible. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Or had the stress of the field exercise, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the Wichita Mountains, played some elaborate trick on my mind? I emerged from my tent to find the camp buzzing with its usual morning activity. Soldiers moved about, breaking down equipment, preparing for the day's training scenarios. Everything seemed so normal, so routine. It was hard to reconcile this mundane scene with the terror I had experienced just hours before. As I made my way to the chow line, I caught sight of Corporal Jenkins. He was engaged in conversation with our platoon sergeant, his face set in its usual stern expression. For a moment, I considered approaching him, seeking some kind of confirmation or explanation for what had happened. But something in his posture, the way his eyes darted occasionally to the tree line, made me hesitate. Throughout the morning briefing, I found it hard to focus. The lieutenant's words about artillery placements and simulated enemy positions washed over me, barely registering. My mind kept drifting back to the woods, to that bizarre encounter. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial, that there was a danger here that went beyond the scope of our training exercise. As we moved out to our designated positions, I found myself scanning the terrain obsessively. Every boulder seemed to hide a potential threat, every cluster of trees a possible hiding place for what? I wasn't even sure what I was looking for anymore. All I knew was that the Wichita Mountains no longer felt like just another training ground. They had become something alien and threatening, a landscape charged with menace. The day's exercises passed in a blur of artillery fire and tactical maneuvers. I went through the motions, performing my duties with a mechanical efficiency that belied the turmoil in my mind. My fellow soldiers noticed my distraction, shooting me concerned glances and whispered questions that I deflected with mumbled excuses about not sleeping well. It was during a lull in the afternoon's activities that Corporal Jenkins approached me. He looked tired, the lines on his face seeming deeper than usual. Without preamble, he pulled me aside, out of earshot of the others. "About last night," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "I need you to understand something. What happens out here in these mountains, it stays here. You got that?" I nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over me. So I hadn't imagined it. Something had happened, something real enough that Jenkins felt the need to address it. "But what was it?" I asked, unable to keep the desperation out of my voice. "What did I see?" Jenkins was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for threats. When he spoke again, his words were careful, measured. "There are things in this world that don't fit neatly into the boxes we're taught about in basic training," he said. "Things that can't be explained by standard military doctrine. These mountains, they're old, older than any of us can really comprehend. And sometimes in places like this, the line between what's real and what's not, it gets blurry." He paused, taking a long drag on his ever-present cigarette before continuing. "I can't tell you what you saw last night. Hell, I'm not sure I want to know. But I can tell you this. You're not the first to have an experience like that out here, and you probably won't be the last." With that cryptic statement, Jenkins clapped me on the shoulder and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. As I watched him go, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, confusion, but also a sort of grim determination. Whatever was out there, whatever Thompson was, I knew that I couldn't simply ignore it or wish it away. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the Wichita Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I made a silent vow to myself. I would uncover the truth behind what I had seen, no matter where that search might lead me. Little did I know that this decision would set me on a path that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. The next few days of our field exercise passed in a haze of heightened alertness and barely contained anxiety. Every night watch became an ordeal, my senses straining for any sign of the otherworldly presence I had encountered. But aside from the usual sounds of the wilderness, the call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the scrub oaks, the Wichita Mountains remained stubbornly, almost mockingly normal. It was during this time that I began to dig deeper into the history of Fort Sill and the surrounding area. In stolen moments between training exercises, I pored over whatever information I could find on my smartphone, hungrily consuming articles about the region's past. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The Wichita Mountains, I learned, had been a sacred place for various Native American tribes long before the arrival of European settlers. The Apache, Comanche, and Kiowa had all called this rugged landscape home at various points in history. Legends and stories abounded of vision quests undertaken in these mountains, of spiritual encounters with beings that defied easy categorization. But it was the more recent history that truly caught my attention. Fort Sill itself had been established in 1869, and in the century and a half since then, it had seen its share of tragedy and conflict. Soldiers had died here, both in training accidents and in the various conflicts that the fort had played a role in over the years. One story in particular stood out to me. In the late 1960s, at the height of the Vietnam War, there had been reports of a soldier who had gone missing during a training exercise in the wildlife refuge. The details were frustratingly vague. Official records seemed to have been either lost or deliberately obscured, but the fragments I could piece together painted a disturbing picture. The soldier, whose name was redacted in the few documents I could find, had apparently wandered off from his unit during a night maneuver. Search parties had combed the area for days, but no trace of him was ever found. What stuck with me, though, was a detail mentioned in a local newspaper article from the time. Several of the searchers had reported strange sightings and unexplained phenomena during the hunt for the missing man. As I read these accounts, a chill ran down my spine. The descriptions, fleeting glimpses of a figure that seemed to melt into the shadows, eerie sounds that couldn't be attributed to any known animal, a pervasive sense of being watched by something ancient and malevolent, all resonated with my own experience. Could it be possible? Had I encountered something connected to this long-ago tragedy? The rational part of my mind rebelled against the idea, insisting that there had to be a logical explanation. But another part, a part that had been awakened by that night in the woods, whispered that perhaps the truth was stranger and more terrifying than anything I had been prepared to believe. My obsession with uncovering the truth began to affect my performance. During day exercises, I found myself distracted, my mind constantly turning over the pieces of this bizarre puzzle. My squad mates noticed, shooting me concerned glances and occasionally covering for my lapses in attention. I was grateful for their support, even if I couldn't bring myself to explain what was really troubling me. It was Corporal Jenkins who finally confronted me about it. He caught me one evening as I was hunched over my phone, frantically scrolling through yet another article about local legends. "You need to let it go, specialist," he said, his voice a mixture of concern and frustration. "Whatever you think you saw out there, whatever you think you're going to find, it's not worth obsessing over. Focus on the mission at hand." I looked up at him, seeing the worry etched in the lines of his weathered face. For a moment I was tempted to confide in him, to share the connections I thought I had uncovered. But something held me back, a combination of fear of being dismissed as crazy and a growing sense that this was something I needed to figure out on my own. "I'm fine, Corporal," I lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle even to me. "Just having trouble sleeping out here, that's all." Jenkins held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear he didn't believe me. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "We've got night fire exercises tomorrow. I need you sharp." As he walked away, I felt a pang of guilt for the deception, but it was overshadowed by a growing determination. I was on to something, I was sure of it. The history of this place, the legends, my own experience, they were all connected somehow. And I was going to figure out how, no matter what it took. Little did I know that my chance to uncover the truth would come sooner than I expected, and in a way that would test not just my courage, but my very grip on reality. The night of the live fire exercise dawned clear and cold, the stars blazing overhead with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. As our unit moved into position, the massive hulks of the howitzers looming against the star-studded sky, I felt a sense of anticipation mixed with dread. Something about the night felt charged, as if the very air was alive with potential energy. Our objective was straightforward, a series of simulated enemy positions scattered throughout a nearby valley. We were to provide artillery support for a hypothetical infantry assault, demonstrating our ability to deliver accurate fire under nighttime conditions. It was the kind of exercise we had trained for countless times, but something about doing it here, in the shadow of the Wichita Mountains, felt different. As we went through our pre-fire checks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced towards the tree line, I half expected to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. The name Thompson echoed in my mind, a constant unsettling refrain. The first volleys lit up the night sky, the flash and thunder of the howitzers momentarily drowning out all other sensations. As we worked to reload and adjust our fire, I fell into the familiar rhythm of the task, my hands moving almost of their own accord. For a while, the sheer intensity of the exercise pushed my darker thoughts to the background. It was during a lull in the firing, as we waited for new coordinates from our forward observers, that it happened. A sound cut through the night, a cough, eerily similar to the one I had heard on that fateful night watch. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkness beyond our position. For a moment I saw nothing. Then at the edge of our floodlit area, a shadow moved. It was just for an instant, a flicker of movement that could have been a trick of the light. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was him. Thompson. Without thinking, I took a step towards the tree line, my hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm. A shout from Corporal Jenkins snapped me back to reality. Fire mission, gun 3, adjust fire. I turned back to my post, my heart racing. As I helped load the next round, my mind was in turmoil. Had I really seen something, or was my overstressed mind playing tricks on me? And if it was real, what did it mean? Why here? Why now? The rest of the exercise passed in a blur of fire and smoke. I performed my duties mechanically, my body going through the motions while my mind grappled with what I had seen. As the last echoes of our final volley faded into the night, I knew that I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to find answers. As we began the process of securing our equipment, I made a decision. Once the post-exercise duties were complete, once the rest of the unit had bedded down for the night, I would go back into those woods, alone if necessary. Whatever was out there, whatever Thompson was, I had to confront it. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of cleaning my station, helping to stow gear, all the while acutely aware of the looming presence of the Wichita Mountains. Finally, as the camp settled into the quiet of the early morning hours, I saw my chance. Slipping away from my tent, I made my way towards the tree line. The night was quiet now, the earlier cacophony of artillery fire replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the leaves and the distant call of a coyote. As I reached the edge of the woods, I paused, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever lay beyond those trees, I was about to face it. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, leaving the relative safety of the camp behind and plunging into the unknown darkness of the Wichita Mountains. The woods seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into their depths. The beam of my flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and dense underbrush. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. But I pressed on, driven by a need for answers that overrode my fear. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that primeval landscape. The familiar sounds of the camp faded away, replaced by the eerie silence of the deep woods. Occasionally I would hear something, a twig snapping, a rustling in the undergrowth, that would make me freeze, my hand tightening on my weapon. But each time the sound would fade, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. It was when I reached a small clearing that I saw it. A figure, standing motionless at the far edge of the open space. Even in the dim light I could make out the tattered uniform, the unnatural stance that was somehow both rigid and fluid at the same time. And those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes that seemed to bore into my very soul. "Thompson," I whispered, the name escaping my lips almost involuntarily. The figure didn't move, didn't react in any way to my presence. It just stood there, watching me with that unblinking gaze. Gathering my courage, I took a step forward. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence of the clearing. "What do you want?" For a long moment there was no response. Then slowly the figure began to move. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was a marionette being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. As it stepped into the full beam of my flashlight, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, the skin stretched tight over protruding bones. The uniform hung in tatters from its emaciated frame, the name tape barely legible. "Thompson." "Thompson," it echoed, its voice a discordant mix of human speech and animal growls. "Thompson, Thompson, Thompson." The name repeated like a mantra, growing louder with each iteration. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing, what I was hearing. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped up, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I felt a rush of something. Images, sensations, emotions that weren't my own flooded my consciousness. I saw flashes of a young soldier, lost and afraid in these very woods. I felt the terror of being alone in the darkness, the gradual realization that he couldn't find his way back. I experienced the slow descent into madness as days turned into weeks, as hunger and thirst warred with a growing sense that something in these mountains wanted him to stay. And then, at the end, a choice. A terrible, impossible choice offered by something ancient and powerful that dwelled in the depths of the Wichita Mountains. A chance at a kind of survival, but at a cost that would strip away his humanity. My name is Donald Simmons, and I've seen things in these woods that would make your blood run cold. At 74 years old, I've spent more time among the towering pines and misty valleys of Olympic National Forest than I have in any town or city. It's in my blood, you see. My father was a ranger here, and his father before him. We're as much a part of this forest as the ancient cedars that have stood watch for centuries. October 12, 2003. That date is seared into my memory, a scar that won't fade no matter how much time passes. It was supposed to be just another day on the job, another routine search for missing campers. Instead, it became the day that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world and the creatures that inhabit it. I remember waking up that morning in my modest cabin on the outskirts of the park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the mist curl through the trees, I had no idea of the horrors that awaited me. No idea that by nightfall, my life would be irrevocably changed. My partner, Dale Flynn, picked me up in our battered Jeep. Dale was a good man, younger than me by a couple of decades, with a quick wit and an easy smile. We'd been working together for 5 years, and I trusted him with my life. If only I'd known how prophetic that trust would become. "Morning, old-timer," Dale grinned as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Ready to rescue some city slickers who can't read a compass?" I grunted in response, not quite awake enough for his early morning cheer. "What's the situation?" Dale's expression sobered slightly. "Group of 5 campers, 2 couples and a single guy. They were supposed to check in at the ranger station yesterday afternoon. No show." I nodded, a faint sense of unease stirring in my gut. It wasn't uncommon for inexperienced campers to lose their way or misjudge the time it would take to hike back. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the weather, unusually still and quiet for this time of year. Or maybe it was just the accumulated instinct of decades spent in these woods. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be anything but routine. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a rough track. We passed the last of the popular camping areas and entered a part of the park rarely visited by tourists. This was old-growth forest, primeval and untamed. "They shouldn't have been this far out," I muttered, more to myself than to Dale. He nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's weird. Their permit was for one of the established campsites near Crescent Lake. No reason for them to come all the way out here." We fell into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The Jeep bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional cry of a distant bird. Finally, we reached the end of the road. From here, we'd have to continue on foot. As we gathered our gear backpacks filled with supplies, first aid kits, and our service weapons, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that had settled over me like a shroud. "Hey, Don," Dale said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "You got a bad feeling about this too?" I met his eyes and saw my own concern mirrored there. "Yeah," I admitted. "Let's stick close together on this one, all right?" He nodded, and together we set off into the shadowy depths of Olympic National Forest, unaware that we were walking into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The forest swallowed us whole as we left the relative safety of our Jeep behind. The canopy overhead was so thick that only slivers of sunlight managed to penetrate, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. The air was heavy with moisture, and the rich scent of decaying vegetation filled our nostrils. We moved cautiously, our eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of the missing campers. Every so often, one of us would call out, our voices echoing unnaturally in the stillness of the forest. "Hello, park rangers, anyone out there?" Only silence answered us. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. I'd spent my entire life in these woods, but something felt off. The usual background noise of the forest, the rustling of small animals, the songs of birds, was noticeably absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Dale," I whispered, not wanting to break the eerie silence too abruptly. "You notice how quiet it is?" He nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Yeah, it's giving me the creeps. What do you think, Don? Animal activity? Maybe a big predator in the area?" I shook my head slowly. I've never known even a bear or mountain lion to shut down the whole forest like this. It's like everything's hiding. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. The terrain became rougher, forcing us to climb over fallen logs and push through dense thickets of ferns and salal. After what felt like hours, we finally stumbled upon the first sign of our missing campers. It was a campsite, tucked away in a small clearing. 2 tents stood erected, their bright nylon a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest. A cold fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by camp chairs and the detritus of a hasty meal. but there was no sign of the campers themselves. "What the hell?" Dale muttered, moving closer to inspect one of the tents. I circled the perimeter of the camp, my eyes searching for any clue as to what might have happened. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. It was as if the 5 people had simply vanished into thin air. "Don, come look at this," Dale called from inside one of the tents. I ducked through the entrance flap and joined him. The interior of the tent was a mess of sleeping bags and backpacks, but what caught my attention was what Dale was holding. A journal, its pages filled with hurried, almost frantic writing. "Listen to this," Dale said, his voice tight with tension. He began to read. October 10th. We're lost. Been walking for hours, but the GPS isn't working. Trees all look the same. Keep hearing strange noises at night. Not animals. At least not any animals I've ever heard before. He flipped to the next page. October 11th. Something is watching us. We can feel it. Eyes in the darkness. Matt wants to keep moving, but we're too exhausted. Setting up camp here. God help us. The final entry was just a single line, the handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. They're here. A chill ran down my spine as Dale finished reading. We looked at each other, the same thought mirrored in our eyes. Whatever had happened here, it was far beyond the scope of a normal search and rescue operation. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. But as I keyed the mic, all I got was static. No signal. Dale checked his own radio with the same result. "Damn," he swore softly. "We're on our own out here." I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never encountered anything like this. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But we had a job to do. 5 people were missing, and it was up to us to find them. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to expand our search, but we stick together, understand? No matter what happens, we don't separate." Dale nodded grimly. We exited the tent and stood in the center of the abandoned campsite, trying to decide which direction to take. That's when we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. And it was close, too close. Dale's face had gone pale. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that we were in grave danger. Whatever had taken those campers was still out there, and now it had its sights set on us. "We need to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." As we hurried away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Eyes in the darkness, just like the journal had said. We were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey. We moved through the forest with a sense of urgency, our earlier caution replaced by a growing fear. The howl we'd heard seemed to echo in my mind, a constant reminder of the unknown threat that lurked in the shadows around us. Dale and I barely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and meaningful looks. As we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There, on the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, were 3 long, deep gouges. They started about 7 feet up the tree and ran almost to the ground. "Dale," I whispered, pointing at the marks. He examined them closely, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "What could have done this, Don? A bear?" I shook my head slowly. "I've never seen a bear leave marks like that. Look at the height, the depth of the gouges. Whatever did this, it's big, and it's not anything I've ever encountered in these woods before." A twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush behind us. We whirled around, hands instinctively going to our weapons. For a long moment we stood frozen, straining our ears for any further sound. But the forest had fallen silent once again. "We should keep moving," Dale said, his voice tight with tension. I nodded in agreement, and we set off once more, our pace quickening with each step. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature bearing down on us. As we crested a small rise, Dale suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing ahead. "Look!" Through a gap in the trees I could see a flash of bright color, the unmistakable red of a hiker's jacket. We approached cautiously, calling out as we did so. "Hello, this is the park rangers. Are you all right?" There was no response. As we drew closer, my heart sank. The jacket was torn and bloody, hanging from a low branch like some macabre flag. Of its owner there was no sign. Dale bent to examine the ground around the tree. "Tracks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've never seen anything like this before." I knelt beside him, studying the impressions in the soft earth. They were huge, easily twice the size of a human foot, with long, curved claw marks at the end of each toe. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these tracks matched perfectly with the gouges we'd seen on the tree earlier. "What are we dealing with here, Don?" Dale asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. I shook my head at a loss for words. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything that could leave tracks like these. We were in uncharted territory, facing a threat we couldn't even begin to understand. That's when we heard it again, that bone-chilling howl, closer this time. It was answered by another, then another, the sounds coming from all around us. We were surrounded. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we fled. I could hear something moving in the forest behind us, a sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls that spurred us to even greater speed. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and twigs scratching at my skin as I rolled. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a small clearing, dazed and disoriented. "Dale?" I called out, struggling to my feet. "Dale, where are you?" There was no answer. In the fall, we'd become separated. I was alone. A low growl from the edge of the clearing froze the blood in my veins. Slowly, I turned to face the source of the sound. There, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a creature out of nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a twisted, almost human visage, with a protruding jaw full of yellowed teeth and small black eyes that glinted with terrifying intelligence. For a moment we stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a silent confrontation. Then, with a roar that shook the very air around us, it charged. I fumbled for my weapon, but my fingers felt clumsy and slow. The creature closed the distance between us with impossible speed. I saw a flash of claws, felt a searing pain across my chest, and then I was on the ground, staring up at the monster that was about to end my life. As it raised its massive paw for the killing blow, a gunshot rang out. The creature jerked back with a snarl of pain and fury. I turned my head to see Dale standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle raised. "Get away from him, you son of a bitch!" Dale yelled, firing again. The second shot caught the creature in the shoulder. It roared in rage, then turned and bolted into the undergrowth with shocking agility for something of its size. Dale rushed to my side, his face pale with shock and fear. "Jesus, Don," he said, examining the deep gashes across my chest. "We've got to get you out of here." I tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet gurgle. The pain was overwhelming, and I could feel myself slipping towards unconsciousness. "Stay with me, partner," Dale urged, pressing his hand against my wounds in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. "Help's on the way. Just hang on." But we both knew it was a lie. We were miles from any help, in a part of the forest where our radios didn't work. I was going to die here, on the damp forest floor, victim to a creature that shouldn't exist. As my vision began to fade, I heard it. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush, coming closer. Dale's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror. "Ellis, close your eyes, don't look," he yelled. But it was too late. The creature burst from the trees, a blur of fur and fury. Dale tried to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow. The monster slammed into him with bone-crushing force, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I watched, helpless, as the creature slammed Dale against a tree. There was a sickening crack, and Dale went limp, his eyes staring sightlessly at nothing. In that moment, something snapped inside me. Pure animal instinct took over. Ignoring the searing pain in my chest, I pushed myself up, searching desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a thick branch, broken off in my fall down the embankment. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The creature turned from Dale's lifeless body, its muzzle stained red with my partner's blood. It snarled, those terrifyingly human eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. As it charged, I summoned every last ounce of strength I had. With an agonized grunt, I pushed myself onto one knee, raising the branch like a spear. The creature's momentum did the rest. It impaled itself on the makeshift weapon, the sharpened end punching through its chest and out its back. Its roar of triumph turned into a surprised gurgle as it collapsed beside me, twitching and choking on its own blood. For a moment I thought it was over. But then, from deeper in the forest, I heard it, another howl, answering the first. And then another and another, too many to count. Panic flooded through me. I wasn't going to make it out of here alive, but some primal part of me refused to give up. With the last of my strength, I began to crawl, dragging myself along the forest floor. Every movement was agony, the gashes on my chest leaving a trail of blood behind me. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The howls were getting closer, a cacophony of inhuman voices that filled the air. I could hear the snapping of branches, the heavy footfalls of multiple creatures converging on my location. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each one sending fresh waves of pain through my body. I don't know how long I crawled. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green hell. But suddenly, through the haze of pain and fear, I saw it. A flicker of light ahead. The trees were thinning out, and beyond them I could make out the faint outline of a road. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I clawed my way forward, feeling the transition from soft earth to rough gravel under my hands. I had made it to the road, but I had nothing left. I collapsed at the edge, my vision blurring as consciousness threatened to slip away. Then, like a miracle, I heard it. The rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights pierced the gloom, illuminating my broken body at the roadside. I tried to call out, to wave, but all I could manage was a feeble croak. The car screeched to a halt. I heard doors slam, voices raised in alarm. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" Hands were on me, gentle but urgent. Someone was on a phone, their voice trembling as they called for help. "It's going to be all right," a woman's voice said close to my ear. "Help is on the way." I wanted to believe her, but even as blessed unconsciousness began to take me, I heard it. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs. They were coming closer. With the last of my strength, I tried to warn them. "Get back!" I managed to gasp. "In the car! Run!" But it was too late. The headlights of the car illuminated the tree line, casting long, sinister shadows. And there, at the edge of the light, they appeared. Dark shapes hunched and monstrous, their eyes glinting in the harsh glare. The people around me began to scream. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see what happened next. When I opened them again, I was in a hospital bed. The smell of antiseptic filled my nostrils, and the steady beep of monitors filled the air. For a moment I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then the pain hit me, a dull, throbbing ache across my chest where the creature's claws had torn into me. Janice, my friend from the ranger station, was sitting by my bed. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her smile trembled as she reached for my hand. "They found you on the side of the road," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A couple of hikers. You were barely conscious." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. Janice brought a cup of water to my lips, helping me take small sips. "Dale?" I managed to croak out. Janice's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly. "Dale didn't make it, Ellis. I'm so sorry." The news hit me like a physical blow. Grief and guilt washed over me in a numbing wave. I closed my eyes, remembering Dale's final moments, his sacrifice that had given me the chance to escape. Over the next few days, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I was visited by doctors, police officers, and park officials. They all wanted to know what had happened out there in the forest. I told them everything about the missing campers, the strange tracks, the monstrous creatures that had attacked us. I could see the skepticism in their eyes as I spoke. They nodded and took notes, but I could tell they didn't believe me. "Trauma," they whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. "Post-traumatic stress. He's blocking out what really happened." But I knew the truth. And so did the hikers who had found me, the ones who had seen the creatures emerge from the forest. But they were gone, vanished without a trace. The official report stated that no one else had been at the scene when the ambulance arrived. I was released from the hospital a week later, my body healing but my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. There was a small memorial service for Dale. I stood there, leaning heavily on a cane as they lowered an empty casket into the ground. His body had never been found. Afterwards, I returned to my cabin, the one I'd lived in for decades. It should have felt safe, familiar. Instead, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind through the trees outside sent jolts of terror through me. The forest that had been my home for so long now felt like a lurking predator waiting to pounce. I tried to go back to work to regain some sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every time I stepped into the woods, panic would overwhelm me. I'd find myself reaching for my gun, jumping at shadows. The other rangers looked at me with pity and fear, whispering behind my back. The nightmares came every night without fail. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the image of those monstrous eyes still burning in my mind. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. That's when I started drinking. At first it was just to help me sleep, to dull the constant fear that gnawed at my gut. But soon, it became the only way I could function at all. They let me go, of course. Said it was for the best, for everyone concerned. I didn't fight it. I barely acknowledged it. My life began to fragment, breaking apart like ice in spring thaw. I drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs when I could, never staying in one place for too long. The bottle became my constant companion, the only thing that could quiet the voices in my head, that could make me forget, even for a little while, the horrors I'd witnessed. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I drank, I couldn't escape. In every rustle of leaves, every shadow at dusk, I saw them. The creatures, waiting, watching, and part of me. The part that still remembered the ranger I used to be. The man who had faced down a monster and lived. That part of me waited too. For the day when the bottle wouldn't be enough. For the day when I'd finally gather the courage to go back into those woods and face my demons once and for all. Because I know they're still out there, in the deep, dark places of the forest where humans rarely tread. And someday someone else will stumble upon them. Someone else will have to face the terror I faced. So I wait. And I remember. And I pray that when the time comes, I'll be ready. Ready to finish what started on that terrible day in Olympic National Forest. Ready to ensure that Dale's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Because in the end, that's all I have left. A mission, a purpose, a reason to keep going, keep fighting, even when every instinct screams at me to give up. The creatures are out there, And someday, somehow, I'll make sure the world knows the truth. But until then, I'll keep moving, keep running, keep hiding from the shadows that haunt my every waking moment. And in the dark of night, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon casts long shadows across the land, I'll raise my bottle in a silent toast to Dale, to the people we couldn't save, and to the hope that someday the nightmare will finally end. But deep down, I know the truth. In this story, there are no happy endings, only survivors, and the knowledge that out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, monsters still roam, real monsters, waiting, watching, hungry, and sooner or later they'll be coming for us all.